Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Osint Bunker podcast. This is season 5, episode 9. We are a little bit late with recording this time round. As some of you will have seen on our social media, we had a series of unforeseen circumstances and sort of difficulties with time zone issues, which has led to this episode being somewhat delayed. I am joined this evening by George and Osinttechnical. We were due to be joined by a guest in the form of Alif, who has been on the podcast a number of times before. Unfortunately, we have not been able to get Alif in for this episode, and he will be joining us for a later episode. So stay tuned for that.
I don't think people fully realize the amount of logistics going into making this one actually happen.
Yeah. For those not aware, ordinarily when we record a podcast, we kind of have sort of Technical and Austin will be on a US time zone or maybe 2 US time zones, and then George and I are obviously UK based, and so that tends to be fairly straightforward, albeit obviously not the simplest situation in the world. On this occasion, we were looking at having obviously Technical on one time zone, George on the UK time zone, myself on Australian East Coast time, and then Alif on whatever time zone Alif currently exists on.
Don't even know what that one is. So
Alif does more travelling than Technical, and that's kind of saying something, because Technical, as many of you will know, has tuned into episodes in the past while on the move or down the Grand Canyon, for example, which obviously is, just showing off, really. But
just wait until I get the full sat phone setup done.
It became a bit of a logistical nightmare, but we are here now. We are recording, and hopefully this episode will be out to you all very, very soon. So
yeah, it is kind of amazing when you think about it, about how far away we are from each other while still having like negligible delay basically on everything. It is kind of remarkable to a degree.
So, without further ado, I suggest we start with, well, sort of the big topic again in the news this morning, or tonight rather, depending on which time zone you're in, and that is, of course, Ukraine-Russia war.
About that one. I have we talked about it before? I don't remember.
I had heard something was happening.
Yeah, no. I heard there might have been explosions in Russia or something, but that's kind of a normal event, right?
Yeah, it's.
I mean, I think since the last time we talked, there have been, because I'm kind of extending out to the main point here, but how many drone attacks have there been on Russian territory in the past like month and change?
I think there's too many to count at this point.
And it's definitely weekly, sometimes
Yes.
even daily. I mean, I think we can summarize it with the culmination of the Russians putting pantsers on towers outside of Moscow. I think that's kind of which in and of itself kind of embarrassing to have to do that. Not entirely novel for the Russians, but definitely an indication of their not incapability per se, because they do down Ukrainian UAVs, but their incapability to keep a sense of safety for their citizens and ensure, I mean, it's really hard to ensure a sense of safety when you aren't able to down, all of the large explosive armed drones coming towards your population centers, and also hitting key civil and military targets like the microelectronics plant in not Berdansk. Actually, maybe in Berdansk. I forget specifically, but the Silicon EL plant that's been hit twice now, I believe. There was one where there was a small fire, and then there was another one where they hit the administration building and really got the third floor on fire and potentially caused additional damage. But that Ukrainian drone campaign has, I think, certainly been successful.
Yeah, even to the point now where the Russians are so scared that they seem to be finding tyres from anywhere and everywhere and placing them atop anything they think might be a target. We've obviously seen, as many of our listeners will have seen, the satellite imagery from various Russian air bases in the last week or so of various aircraft types, notably sort of the strategic bombers, covered in just as many vehicle tyres as they could find.
Well, I asked earlier if it's practical to put tyres on submarines and landing craft, but
Yes,
We're
as
getting there.
George has
We're
alluded,
continuing to bury the lead.
yeah, and it says a lot that, probably a year and a half ago now, there was a general consensus around the world that Russian air defense systems were a force to be reckoned with. Things like the S-400 and the Panzer were a serious threat to enemy aviation. And to a certain extent, they still are. And we've obviously seen Ukrainian aircraft have been downed at various points, but we are now seeing Ukraine very much taking a lead with the use of UAVs in combat, as we say, small explosive laden drones being used to great effect, both tactically on the battlefield with the dozens of videos of grenades being dropped onto tanks, all the way up to, as we've seen in recent weeks, these, I think it's cardboard drones built in Australia that are then being used as suicide drones.
Well, I think the internal Ukrainian effort as well, if you look at the Eskadrone project, which is, I think, how it's Romanized in its pronunciation, but they're shooting for, delivering hundreds of units a week of these small, FPV munitions that are little, or not little, but they're fairly small racing drones that basically have, either an RKG grenade or an OG-7 heat warhead, or occasionally some custom thingamajig, pipe bomb basically, attached to it, and flown into a Russian position or vehicle or some sort of high value asset, um, and destroying it. And I mean, obviously, our view of that situation is, to a degree, sanitized, and that we only see the successes because, inherently, I mean, we do occasionally see videos of these munitions getting hit by Russian electronic warfare, um, but we're really 90% of the content, or probably 99% of the content that Escadrone releases are successful videos. But still, if you look at just the quantity alone, even if they're losing a ton of munitions, they're still managing to make just this huge impact on the front. And I mean, if we we've seen enough, random videos of, like, oh, here's, a video from the front. There'll inevitably be, one or two of these drones that'll slam into a position nearby. There was recently a video released by some Russian soldiers in not Robotny, but South Robotny, where they spent half the video panicking about, the Ukrainians are going to be flying these tiny little drones at us. We need to leave. We need to get out of here. Um, and I think that is a major aspect of life on the front right now.
Yeah, and it's been interesting from a UK perspective to see, particularly in the last week, and obviously with the last couple of days, we've had the DSEI event in London, where a lot of UK and US defence companies have announced new swarming drone projects,
So
which,
many drones.
as much as some of these projects had been in planning for some years now, it's interesting to see that with sort of the impact they're having on the conflict in Ukraine, a lot of these companies are now really pushing these designs. I think there was one
Well,
in particular that caught my attention from I think it was the UK firm Kinetic. Let me just see if I've got the details to hand. It
Jackdaw.
was yes. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, George, but Jackdaw is effectively planned to be a sort of medium altitude swarming, but also sort of
Yeah.
ultra low cost UAV that
So
can.
it's marketed as an autonomous, low-cost swarm.
Hmm,
Those terms appear frequently on the marketing material for that drone, and I believe it's modified. Well, so it's incredibly modified Banshee 80.
hmm.
I could be wrong on that.
And the Banshee, obviously, at the minute is one of the Royal Navy's sort of target practice UAVs, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Which is the
Kinetic.
one that they showed off, which is the larger quadcopter dropping small little FPV munitions or smaller swarming drones.
I'm not
Oh,
aware of that one.
I saw that in a video. I think
Yeah,
I can't
I
remember what
saw
it's
it. I
called
saw it seen. It's hanging up somewhere. We'll send George back into the hall to go find it.
now. But yeah, the impact that Ukraine's use of these drones is having on sort of the rest of the world is quite noticeable at this stage. And obviously,
Well,
drone technology is advancing and is obviously a key focus point for several militaries. The US itself announced a project that it's been working on for a while, the Long Shot program, which I believe was a DARPA project originally, and General Atomics, I think, is going to be producing the prototypes for that, and that's very much an air to air combat UAV. Again, emphasising autonomous, emphasising the swarming capabilities. Um, Potentially something that in the long term, because it certainly won't be ready for operations anytime in the near future, but potentially in the long term could well see its way into service in Ukraine.
there is a saying at DSEI, and I'm assuming many of the listeners know that's effectively the Olympics of arms fairs. There is a saying, flak is back, obviously representing an increased desire to counter drones, and I think the old tech can sometimes be the best option. Just shoot them down rather than soft kill defenses.
Mm,
I mean, as we saw from last night, the Ukrainians are very invested, or at least forced into using traditional older anti-aircraft artillery systems,
Yeah.
which I think the ZU-23-2 counts as anti-aircraft artillery.
yeah.
Um, but they're using those systems and small arms, just because the current cheap long range attack drones are kind of slow. Propeller driven. You're within the realm of possibility to down it with a small arm, with a gun, with a rifle.
Yeah.
Um, I think that is or at least one of the realistic options looked at right now.
At DSEI, UK naval gun firm MSI, the makers of typically things along the lines of 30 millimeters. They've teamed up with a Polish company to produce a hard kill drone air defense system. It really does look like, I should send you guys the pictures of this. It looks like an old sort of World War II flat cannon. Obviously, it's automated, it's CUAS, or all of the bells and whistles, but it looks so old school.
Mm.
I mean, I think Orlikon is still making guns that
Oh,
look
yeah.
pretty much exactly the same as they did in 1937.
Yeah. As they say, if it works, don't fix
Yeah.
it. Um,
Yeah, though I will say the theme for a show like AUSA, back in back last year, actually, almost a year ago, was really focused on countering drones. There was some focus on drones. I forget who it was, but someone came up with basically a mock-up of a fairly large quadcopter with a couple of RPG, or not RPGs, but the law analogs strapped to it, which in hindsight, like after another year watching Ukraine, is just stupid. Like everything about it is stupid. But the real focus there was countering drones. And I think, would you guys say DSEI this year is more about utilizing drones?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. The British Army are showing off their latest Brimstone equipped Hydra 400, I think. The Royal Navy are showing off the.
that's probably the one that you were asking about, technical, the Hydra 400.
Yeah. There's also the
Big
T600.
quadcopter with 3 brimstones strapped to the underside.
No,
Oh,
this
yeah,
this
the
is a
naval.
different one. This had little quadcopters strapped to it.
I haven't seen
I'll
anything
find it.
about
I'll
it.
find it, and I will note to editor.
Are we sure it's real? Could this have
I
just been a dream you've
absolute
Technical
nightmare.
dreaming about new types of drones.
Go sell the idea.
No, but
No, but
you're right. A lot of the stands involve new drones, novel applications of drones, and I think one of my favourites. Unfortunately, as I'm sure you both know, I wasn't able to attend, so I've been doing everything online via the online briefings, all that interesting stuff. So the T600 on the experimental vessel, the Patrick Blackett, it carries a full-size torpedo, and I think that's incredible. That gives torpedo capability to even the smallest of ships.
yeah, torpedo capability to I guess minesweepers to your small offshore patrol vessels. Um, though granted, I think there might be a question there of actually finding the sub to shoot at, but
Yeah,
there.
unclear how they'd prosecute such targets, but well.
Well, they can prosecute them. They can't exactly search for them.
True.
They can definitely throw a torpedo in their general direction. They just might not know what they're searching for.
So to randomly chuck out torpedoes, I think, is the theme of DSEI this year.
It's cheap enough to be expendable.
Why
And
find and
I
fix
think
when you
that
can chuck over the side?
I think that is an element with the drones as well, as in, it's, in military parlance, a $20,000 drone is cheap.
Yeah.
And so I think, or maybe for the UK MOD, that's a pretty big chunk of the budget. But for most organizations, that is a fairly low cost alternative.
Now, technical, could you have been referring to Airlander? I don't know if anyone's aware of this in here. It's obviously the big airship. There was a lot of footage, I say footage, CGI, of Airlander releasing a swarm of smaller quadcopters and other types of drones. Or was it a quadcopter releasing drones?
Yeah, it was a quadcopter releasing smaller quadcopters. This is another note for the
Those
editor
quadcopters
is find a picture of this so I don't look crazy.
and those smaller quadcopters, they also release smaller quadcopters, who then release even smaller.
It's
It's a Russian doll situation.
the Mostrovka, it's all the way down to nanobots. No, I do believe that is an element of it. Or I'm not crazy. Don't call me crazy. I'm only mildly unhinged. But I do think that was something that was seen, and I'll find it at some point. Who knows?
Okay.
I'm not crazy. But no, back more to the DSCI stuff. I definitely do think there is that increased focus on unmanned platforms, sort of driving the acquisition cycle, or at least the advertising cycle. It's always the new kind of shiny, interesting stuff that gets the most attention. But I definitely think that we've seen, at least in Ukraine, the really hard use of unmanned systems at sort of all levels. Oh, and actually, speaking of all levels, I think was it now 3 weeks ago we saw another couple of TB2 strikes, um,
Yeah.
which is definitely interesting to see there. After a pretty big gap in TB2 activity, sort of those high level UAS assets or more long range larger drones that are a bit more vulnerable to actually getting shot down have been a bit more prevalent near the front, or correction, haven't been more prevalent towards the front as you know. I mean, early on in the war, we did see TV2s, operate not with impunity over Russian formations, but definitely more than the Russians certainly would have liked, and were able to conduct strikes on Russian assets, which I think is there is a place for these large drones again in air defense environments that are more permissive, and apparently the Russians unintentionally allowed a permissive air defense environment to exist in Ukraine for a few weeks. Um, but I definitely think that those, or as we've seen at least, pop back up, the longer range UAVs have a place. Actually, speaking about that, George, you did you want to talk about the UK carrier resupply drone?
Yeah, so I don't know how many people are aware of this, but the UK has made at least UK naval history and launching and recovering a fixed wing cargo drone. It's part of efforts undertaken by HMS Prince of Wales, who finally made it to sea. She's still at sea just now and isn't heading towards any sort of dry dock. So let's just focus on that as a good thing. So yeah, she's heading to the US just now to trial Mojave drones. Effectively, I think those are modified. Is it Sky Guardian or Sea Guardian drones? MQ-9Bs anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's a big plus for the UK because it means the more drones you have on deck, the less F-35s you have to buy. The original plan for the carriers was that because the relay would only be one air wing shared between two of the ships, it'd be very unlikely for the UK to deploy two in any sort of operational capacity. Now, two are deployed just now. One's away for trials with a handful of aircraft on board, and the other is away to sail around the
Mediterranean.
North Atlantic, the Med, yeah, with a reasonable number on board, a functioning operational warship. But having these drones is a huge part in the playbook that will see the United Kingdom hopefully being able to deploy two aircraft carriers at the same time in an operational capacity.
And the question
Sorry, that was
is that or is that not with U.S. Marine Corps assets on board as well?
I think it's highly unlikely we'll see a fully sovereign UK air wing on a UK carrier. For the UK doesn't have the mass, it doesn't have the personnel, it doesn't have the resources to do that in anything but the most extreme circumstances. With a budget as stretched as it is, having American planes on the deck, not only, it's better from an operational point of view, it's better from a learning, training point of view, it just looks better from a public relations point of view. As I'm sure, many listening will know, the UK and the carriers, it's a complex, media history, and that they're frequently derided as white elephants without aircraft.
Mm.
So many people, still refer to them as aircraftless carriers, people who will respond to an image of the ship, with its deck full of aircraft, half of which, are often American F-35s. They'll still respond to those images with claims the carrier has no aircraft. So again, to cut my sort of rant here short, this is fantastic for the UK, but it's not going to be done without American involvement. I can't
Yeah.
see how.
I think
Oh,
from
I completely agree with that. Yes.
I think from memory, Queen Elizabeth on this occasion is deploying with 8 F-35s from the UK, all of them
Yeah,
from 617 Squadron, alongside, I believe, there's 3 Wildcat helicopters from the Army Air Corps and 5 Merlins from the Royal Navy, also
yeah.
on board.
Now where will they be going?
So, as I understand it, the Carrier Strike Group on this occasion is due to conduct, as George said, a short patrol in the North Atlantic, followed by a longer stint in the Mediterranean. I don't believe it's planning to go beyond the Mediterranean on this occasion. So we will probably
No,
see it popping into various NATO ports along sort of the Mediterranean coastline. But I believe the deployment is due to last from now round to Christmas. Is that correct?
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I think the same
And then Prince of
actually.
Wales will be over in the States. No, that is definitely interesting to see, at least, or actually not interesting. It is a standard continuation of bilateral, you know, partnerships across the North Atlantic between the U.S. and the U.K. in actively, fielding assets and integrating them into sort of a combined NATO structured force.
Well, yeah, that's a large part of what Prince of Wales is doing. A lot of the work that we're doing will be with American, specifically American aircraft, such as Osprey tilt rotors. I think this was what the vessel was supposed to be doing last year before the incident I never mentioned had happened. But things seem to be back on track, and I think with an increasing sort of emphasis on drones, I think it's maybe a good thing that it was delayed due to circumstances I won't speak about again, because I think that's all I do. But yeah,
Yeah,
until then,
I think it's a question of whether or not the weight was good versus, incident that would not be mentioned interfering with sort of posturing against a Russian invasion.
I don't think there's been any sort of real operational impact on the Royal Navy for this. It's been incredibly embarrassing for them, but it's 2023. We're in a different geopolitical environment.
Yeah.
Let's just see what happens now.
And so where
So,
where does Royal Navy ship procurement stand right now? I know there was just a small batch of warships that went up for sale. Is it sale or just disposition?
Yeah, so we've seen the old Type 82 destroyer HMS Bristol, a couple of recently decommissioned Type 23 frigates,
yeah,
and there was another ship, and I can't remember what it was.
I think it was a Sandown, maybe.
Yeah,
Oh,
have
God.
been listed on the MOD's website as ready for sale for scrap,
Yeah,
which is going to be sad to see those vessels obviously be scrapped. In the past, the Royal Navy has sometimes sold on some of its warships to other countries for further use. I think in the case of the Type 23s, particularly, these are ships that have been worked very, very hard for a very, very long period of time. Most of the hulls in the Type 23 frigate class now are at or approaching 25 years of service. And so they
oh
are
yeah.
very, very worn out. And so, unfortunately, on these occasions, it's obviously been evaluated that they're unlikely to provide much continued service to anyone else. We've
Even
obviously
the
seen. Go
sorry, John. Just continue.
on. No, go on, go on.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that even unofficially, HMS Wins. I can't speak. HMS Win. Oh my gosh, HMS Westminster has unofficially been scrapped. It seems. I think. I don't know if you're aware or not. Her refit was basically put on hold because it would cost too much money.
Yeah,
She's
yeah,
in such a poor state. It would be difficult to justify the expense of repairs. So there is a decision pending on her future to come, and it's not. It doesn't look good. She's been moved from I can't remember the exact terminology. I think it's the frigate refit centre. But yeah, she's been removed out of that to put in a basin herself.
I'm continually surprised that there is a museum ship interest in the Bristol, being of a very unique class and existing in a very unique and historical state.
I
yeah,
don't think museum ships do particularly well in the UK, especially not naval museum ships. There have been so many proposals to purchase and display. I think was it Invincible or Ark Royal or
yes,
one of them. It seems like nearly every frigate or destroyer that goes out of service, there's some proposal from somewhere. Even right now, the ex HMS. Oh, it was a Type 21. And it's in Pakistan just now. It's just retired from the
yes.
Pakistani Navy. There's a proposal to bring that to Glasgow, but no one wants to pay for it. The council haven't given any sort of plan permission for it. The agreement is basically such that the Pakistani Navy have said, if you want this, come and get it.
Yeah.
And I think for the last 3 or 4 years, at the very least, there has been pretty intense campaigning for HMS Bristol, but no one wants to pay for it. And I honestly, the amount of upkeep required for a vessel like that to sit, at least to sit in the water, would be prohibitive. Unless it be in an area, for example, HMS Belfast in London does fantastic. I think part because of it's such a iconic looking ship. It's what people would associate with a Royal Navy ship. It looks.
Yeah.
Now, listeners will know it's not a battleship, but when people think of a battleship, they think of a ship that looks like that. HMS Bristol isn't particularly impressive to look at. So I can't see it really being worth the effort. But
She
that's a
has the
decision.
advantage of being on the Thames in London, and
Yeah,
therefore being
yeah,
part of sort of a perception of London's skyline, and that's
yeah,
to an extent part of the reason she does as well as she does, and is
yeah,
able to be sustained in that location. Um,
Well,
unfortunately,
I,
it's
I continue. I continually find it funny because the U.S. is able to manage to keep what 5 aircraft carriers. How many 7 battleships currently in a museum state? A lot of destroyers.
yeah,
Um, and most of those are frankly only partially or very in a hands-off manner run by usually state level governments or basically they just throw a bit of budget money at private or volunteer driven organizations to maintain and upkeep these vessels. um, and to be frank, it is those volunteer organizations are very proactive, both in fundraising, maintaining, and continuing to keep these ships going. I know the battleship New Jersey is what about 8 months away from going into dry dock for a complex dry docking that's going to be primarily donation driven,
yeah,
with some funding from the state of New Jersey. Um, the Texas is currently in dry dock right now, um, and is going through some very very complex dry dock work that was somewhat um, privately funded and somewhat publicly funded, and it's a lot of these ships have gone through these complex procedures over the past, I don't know, 20 years. I mean, we've dry docked, I think, 4 or 5 battleships in the last 20 years now, if you count the New Jersey. Um, and so it is very interesting to see kind of that difference.
yeah. And again, to an extent, it comes down, I think, to the public and the political perception of sort of the military and military history. I
yeah,
mean, there's been a lot of issues in recent years with ensuring that we've had appropriate funding in the UK to keep things like the Red Arrows and the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight in operation, which obviously, public perception wise, these are sort of major parts
yeah,
of the British image. And that's probably the only reason that those things have been saved from the MOD's wide sweeping budget cuts. But we are fast approaching a point where the MOD is having to cut so much from so many places that even the Red Arrows are potentially not safe any longer.
And it is interesting to see because who made the comment about the MOD being its most lethal, or the was it just the army, or was it the British Armed Forces as a whole, being the most lethal fighting force ever by 2030?
I think that was
oh god, yeah.
General Sir Patrick Sanders, but let me just double
Sanders, I think,
check
yeah.
that. Um,
And that was a very interesting quote, and I'll let you find who said it, but because technically, yes, they will probably be on the individual level very lethal. There just won't be depth or breadth. It'll be a very small fighting force that's very capable, or has capabilities, but is just very small.
Yeah, but certainly the most lethal in a bar fight. But a conflict over a continent, perhaps not.
Or maybe in a small expeditionary capability.
Yeah.
But it,
Oh
it,
yeah,
it, it
I
just
was just
seems
being a
like
bit
there's
flippant.
well, I mean, if you look at the size of it, in 2030, it might be enough to staff a bar fight, but there really does seem to be that interest in abandoning Manning and abandoning sort of depth in order to, I mean, the MOD is obviously working with what it's given to become a very agile fighting force in what it does. The investment in unmanned systems and experimental systems is certainly there.
But Alpha, I should probably explain to any listeners who somehow are unaware, the UK has welcomed a new Defence Secretary. Among his many names, the one we all know him as is Grant Sharp. Sharps, rather. There we go. From his early days as a photocopier sales rep, he moved into the printing and website sector with his venture. Print House something or other. It's not important, but later controversies arose surrounding testimonials that were giving on his website. I think there was 3 or 4 fake names that it turned out that he had used to give those testimonials. Those websites no longer exist. Now, however, falling foul of Google's copyright rules. We also recently learned of Sharp's marketing of an alleged get-rich-quick toolkit, which took the form of a just under $500, I think. Just under it was just under $500. It was an ebook that directed the owner of the ebook to direct others to buy more ebooks from them. So I think he's served. We were talking about this earlier on, and we weren't quite sure how long he has actually been an MP, but I looked it up. 18 years. So in those 18 years, Sharps has only raised 79 defence-related questions, which averages about 4 questions per year. So in comparison to his counterparts and people who've had the post previously, that is incredibly low. His engagement in defence matters is minimal at best, and I think that was exemplified. I think it was a couple of weeks ago when he was on LBC. Now, I'm sure you both have heard of this. The Royal Navy's aircraft carriers apparently handed over to the Royal Air Force. Sharps mistakenly attributed the vessels to the RAF amongst a dozen or so different slip-ups that you might expect from an MP, of any department, just not the United Kingdom's Defence Secretary. And that's where we are in 2023. I'm sorry for that rather depressing rant, but it needed said.
Yeah, I think as we agreed in pre-recording discussions, obviously Ben Wallace, who is the now outgoing and retired, if you like, Defence Secretary, has been probably one of the better Defence Secretaries the UK has had for a fairly significant period of time.
Absolutely.
And it was never going to be easy to find someone to adequately replace him. Unfortunately, I think, as you've said, the choice of Grant Shapps was probably one of the worst decisions to be made. That is obviously our opinion, and if in the months to come he somehow redeems himself, then obviously we will be immensely pleased by that. But it doesn't bode well for UK defence, particularly at a time when we've obviously had a defence refresh this year, which was very big on sort of strategic terms and very, very weak in terms of actual details of what is being paid for, what is being cut. We've obviously in recent days seen confirmation again that the Type 32 frigates will eventually be a thing, albeit we're probably not likely to hear much about that now until sort of the 2030s.
Yeah.
George obviously spends a great deal of time dealing with folks on social media who claim that the Type 26 and the Type 31 frigates are not being built in Scotland. I won't go too much. I won't go too much into that because I don't want to set him off. But
Me never.
But it's yeah, the timing for this, and particularly with a major war in Europe at the moment, it's not great timing. We totally understand the reasons that Ben Wallace has obviously stepped down from the role. It is a demanding role, both physically and emotionally, but also it's the amount of time that you have to spend effectively on call available should a situation arise is not something to be taken lightly. And obviously, Ben Wallace and his family have been impacted massively by his tenure in that post. So as I said to on Twitter myself, the British people are immensely grateful to Ben Wallace for his role in that position over the last few years, and we do wish him the best with his future endeavours.
Absolutely, and that was a position shared by the front bench, defence spokespeople of all the main parties. I think it's important to note that his service was respected by, the majority in Parliament, so it's not a party political issue.
He did appear to be one of those figures that kind of transcended party politics in a way to be more of an international figure, if anything.
I mean, I think was he potentially could not have been one of the frontrunners for Tory leadership, but ruled himself out to concentrate on the job that he was
He
doing.
did, yes, and he was
Yeah.
also more recently a contender for the next NATO Secretary General. And obviously, that in the end didn't work out for reasons that are myriad and complicated and largely political.
But you mean the eternal god emperor Jens Stoltenberg is going to step down at any point?
Well, he's been
Not
given
step
another
down,
year
merely
in
evolved
office.
to a new
So.
form. Just to bring, obviously you mentioned correcting people on social media. I won't go too much into that, but it was, in terms of perception, the stark contrast between Sharps and Wallace. So Wallace would often be the one leading the corrections on Twitter. You'd see him quote tweet, incorrect stories, whereas now it's those stories are about mistakes Sharps has made. So that's where we are.
The strength of a good media team should never be underestimated.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that a lot of figures disregard to a degree, and it ends up hurting them. Also to a varying degree. Though I think some of the line or some of the idea when we came to, UK force disposition and UK force positioning, especially on the naval side of things, there would you say there's a thinking currently at the moment that the rapidly declining Russian navy for from some very certain sources may be part of the calculus there?
Some sort of a twisted peace dividend, only a war dividend from Russia doing so poorly.
Well, I mean, put it this way: the Ukrainians to destroy or hit a major Russian shipyard with British supply or potentially British or French supplied Storm Shadow cruise missiles, and those are surface assets that the Russians can no longer use.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but so Ukraine, which to all intents and purposes at the start of the war didn't really have what one would call a navy, has now sunk the cruiser Moskva, the landing ship Minsk, and has even managed potentially to seriously damage the Kilo class submarine at Rostov on Don. That's quite an impressive feat for a nation that hasn't really got a surface warfare capability. As we've seen,
Well, I think it.
the Kerch Bridge has been a casualty on several occasions in the last year and a half.
I mean, I think it shows how relatively untenable the Russian position in Crimea is. In that, they want a navy base there. Well, great. The Ukrainians are going to make the base unusable,
Mm.
despite Russian attempts to counter that. And I think that we'll probably continue to see this happening, and the Russians could have just stayed in never pronounce it, Novorossiysk. They could have stayed there, and they would have been well and safe. But they wanted the strategic port of Crimea, and the strategic port of Crimea is now a very large, or the strategic port of Sevastopol is now a very large Ukrainian shooting range, effectively. And I definitely think that, again, as I said, the Ukrainians will continue to make Crimea an untenable area for Russia to occupy. And that may be, who knows if that's a deciding factor in the war.
As I said on Twitter, it's just unfortunate for the Ukrainians, really, that the Admiral Kuznetsov aircraft carrier wasn't a little bit closer to Ukrainian territory right now, because I would imagine that would also be even if just for the sort of propaganda element, it would be a very
I think there might be
helpful
accusations that
friendly
the sinking
target.
of that vessel would be a false flag, because it's very likely to sink itself.
Yeah.
All right, do we want to wrap things up here?
I need to go walk a dog.
I think we should just quickly mention sort of the other major sort of world story of the last month or so. Africa has had interesting and tumultuous times in recent years. Obviously, many of you will remember sort of the Arab Spring of, what was it, 2011 ish? And to an extent, we're starting to see sort of the same level of turmoil occurring again on the African continent. In the last 3 or 4 weeks, we have seen, what is it, 4 or 5 different coups take place. Unfortunately, none of us here on the podcast today are particularly experts when it comes to events on the African continent. But I think from memory, we've seen coups in Niger, Gabon. There was some sort of uprising in Burkina Faso. Where else have we seen some issues in the last few weeks?
Well, it is interesting to see, because at least the coup in Gabon was more custodial in nature, in kind of a reverse from the normal coup procedures. The coup leaders actually re-enabled the country's internet access, which had been shut down days previously, after the election. And that was I think that's an interesting vignette, to the kind of other coups, which government shuts down internet, shuts down communication, makes it so they can't, so people can't rebel or can't organize against them. Where in this case, the coup leaders were extremely confident in the public support. And I think there is certainly a question there of if it is a popular coup, supported by the people, is it a coup? Which is one of those questions there.
Yeah, and we've obviously seen in one of the cases of one of the coups, I believe it was the one in Niger, there was a lot of concern from the neighbouring countries to the point where discussions were had, and there was sort of an announcement made by this alliance of neighbouring countries that they were looking into conducting a military intervention. Now, obviously, that military intervention thus far has not materialised, and I certainly won't be holding my breath. But it's interesting to see that situation unfolding, and again, the sort of the mass bloodshed that is normally associated with coups seems to have been largely missing from a lot of these situations. And as you say, technical, in a couple of cases, these coups have actually had widespread public support. In either
Yeah, I mean, I think
case,
at the end of the
on.
or certain areas are vulnerable to coups. And I think we've seen that for what, 60 years now, maybe more. Not that it's standard operating procedure, but it's certain countries and certain areas are just vulnerable to them. Turkey, per se, had a coup like once every 8 years for a good amount of time. And so I think you do see that to a degree.
And it's worth noting that some of these countries where these coups have been taking place, a good number of them have in recent years had the presence of Russian Wagner mercenaries. How much of a destabilizing effect those mercenaries have had on these countries is obviously a topic for another day, maybe. But it's also worth noting that with NATO, particularly, and other sort of global powers being focused largely on events in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, there's not been an awful lot of movement other than sort of a few statements from the French government when it comes to the situations that are unfolding on the African continent. And I think that's reflective of the way that things are heading globally. For some time now, obviously, China has been expanding its influence in Africa and elsewhere. And to a certain extent, they are obviously more invested now in the future of various nations in that continent than perhaps the sort of old colonial nations who once held sort of control of vast areas of the continent. But it will be interesting to see, particularly in the next couple of months, how those situations in Africa develop, whether those coups end up resolving themselves peacefully, as it seems some of them are at the moment, and whether there ends up being a sort of African League of Nations intervening in one or more of these situations.
I think I think it is important to remember that the multiple members of ECOWAS, which is the alliance that John's been talking about, are currently suspended because the governments were couped. That is one of the elements to remember there.
Indeed. And I think with that we will call it a day. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. Once again, our apologies for the late nature of this episode and the fact that we are a little bit behind schedule. We will hopefully be back in a couple of weeks' time with another episode and with a guest appearance again. So thank you all very much for listening. This has been the Osinttechnical podcast.